She found a secret buried in the shadows of her own grief. And now, every look, every silence could be a trap. Hello, my friends. Before we dive into the secrets of the Celestial Duchess, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. The veil of morning was still hanging over Southampton when the port bells announced the embarkation of the majestic Celestial Duchess. The mist crept between the docks, as if trying to hold back the footsteps of those who were leaving. Eleanor Wycliffe watched the vessel with the silent reserve of someone who had seen too much and lost even more. Wrapped in a grey wool coat and fine leather gloves, the widow carried not only her luggage, but the debris of a life of appearances and diplomatic silences. The death of her husband, Sir Edmund Wycliffe, days before Christmas, had been hushed up by the embassy with a coldness that reeked of conspiracy. Now, far from the plastic condolences and pitying glances of London society, she sought shelter on the trip offered by friends of the deceased, a 3-week crossing to the South Atlantic, under the pretext of leisure, but marked from the beginning by a restlessness that throbbed under her skin like an unspoken secret. On the eve of her departure, among linen handkerchiefs and silver medallions, Eleanor had found the unexpected, a letter folded in 4, hidden inside a worn copy of Hamlet. The French was elegant, the handwriting firm and almost masculine. The signature was just an L, but the content was enough to freeze her blood. The mission is not over, and he did not die by accident. There are eyes aboard the ship. Trust no one. The paper smelled damp and old, and Eleanor reread each line as if deciphering an omen. Was this a morbid joke, a provocation, or the key to understanding the whispers and closed doors that surrounded Edmund's final days? With the letter tucked away between the folds of her dress, she walked up to the deck, certain that this would be no ordinary crossing. There, under the cloudy April sky, the sea seemed to hide more than it promised. The Celestial Duchess was a masterpiece of naval engineering and aristocratic ostentation. Its corridors gleamed like cathedrals of gold and mirrors, and the tea rooms boasted Persian tapestries and hired pianists to maintain the air of refinement. The crew was attentive, and the passengers, diplomats, explorers, writers, and even minor royals, dressed as if every day were a gala. Eleanor, though accustomed to the rituals of high society, felt out of place amid the crystal glasses and the performative laughter. The looks were too sweet, the words too polite, and behind the smiles there was something else, something she was watching. When the captain announced that departure was confirmed and the engines began to vibrate beneath her feet, Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. It wasn't just grief that accompanied her. It was the feeling that she was being followed by an enigma she didn't yet dare to name. It was during the inaugural dinner that Eleanor noticed a man who stood out, albeit subtly. He wore an impeccably tailored but not overly so suit. His eyes, the grey of ancient steel, scanned the room with studied serenity. Archibald Grey, his name had been whispered by a talkative baroness to her right, was a consulting detective known in discreet circles at Scotland Yard, especially for solving cases that the police preferred not to discuss in public. He was the kind of man who seemed to carry a library in his eyes and a blade between the lines. When their eyes met, Eleanor felt something different. It wasn't simple attraction. It was the discomfort of being read from the inside, of having her mask perceived as such. Archibald didn't greet her right away, but he raised his glass slightly. She returned it with a subtle nod. "You look distressed," he would say hours later, in a casual tone, as if commenting on the weather. "The journey has only just begun," she would reply, with a half smile that hid a hurricane. That same night, as the waves shimmered under a full moon, and the halls rang with chamber music, Eleanor returned to her cabin. Turning on the lamp, she noticed that her suitcase had been rummaged through. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, but the books were in a different order. The dress she would wear the following night was inside out. Heart pounding, she opened the letter again, trying to find in Elder's words a clue she had missed. Someone on board knows who you are. The words danced before her eyes like a veiled warning. Outside, footsteps echoed down the corridor and stopped at her door. Eleanor held her breath. Nothing happened, only silence. Then the footsteps moved on. But for her, something inside this voyage had already changed. The nagging knowledge that her husband's ghosts had not remained on dry land. At breakfast the next morning, Eleanor noticed Archibald Gray again, now sitting by the tea-room window, watching the sea with the calm of a man who listens more than he speaks. He sipped his tea slowly and made notes in a small leather notebook. When their eyes met again, Eleanor felt a strange calm, as if, for the first time since her husband's death, someone on this ship was actually interested in understanding her rather than in flattering her. He approached, politely excused himself, and with a slight smile said, "I do not usually interrupt ladies in silence, but something in your face tells me that you value truth more than appearances." Eleanor set the teacup down on its saucer with almost military precision. "It depends on the truth, Mr. Gray. Some are like poison, inevitable, but fatal." The detective's gaze gleamed with an interest that went beyond protocol. There, among porcelain and carved wood, the tension began to take on another form, more subtle, more intimate, like the prelude to a dance that both still pretended not to recognize. That afternoon, Eleanor decided to explore the upper deck, where few passengers ventured because of the strong wind. As she walked, she passed some peculiar figures. A Hungarian count with a waxed moustache who smoked silently and read Mein Kampf in German, something that made her frown. A young Italian painter who talked to herself and drew hooded figures, and an elderly French writer who flinched every time someone mentioned the name Lucien. There was certainly an atmosphere of ill-fitting pieces. Every face seemed loaded with incomplete stories, like characters in a poorly edited novel. As she approached the railing, she noticed a white envelope slipped discreetly under the windowsill of her cabin, still visible from the deck above. With a sinking heart, she hurried down. The envelope had no return address, only the words, "What he left behind is more dangerous than you can imagine." The message was written in the same handwriting as Elhir's letter. Eleanor didn't know if that was a warning, a threat, or both. Later that evening, Archibald Gray intercepted her in the corridors after dinner. The air between them was tense, but the tension that arose there was not hostility. "I see that you are worried and suspicious. You must know that I am not the only one watching you on this ship, but perhaps the only one willing to help you." Eleanor hesitated for a moment, meeting his serious eyes. "And what exactly did you observe, Mr. Gray?" He smiled slightly, but did not answer immediately. Instead, he handed her a small silver bracelet bearing the crest of French intelligence, the same one she had seen in Edmund's secret documents years ago. "I found this hidden behind a panel in the reading room. It does not seem to me the kind of jewelry that one would accidentally lose." Eleanor took it with trembling hands. The air around her seemed heavy. "Do you know what this means?" he asked. "I know enough to know that my husband was not just a diplomat." Archibald shook his head. "And that's why we're on the same ship, madam." The next day, Eleanor and Gray met again. this time more strategically, in the ship's inner gardens, among ferns and small artificial fountains that pretended to be natural. She took the original letter with her, and together they studied every detail in the soft light that filtered through the stained glass windows in the ceiling. This ink is common among French diplomatic documents from the 1920s. And look, here at the bottom, there is a small mark in the shape of a lyre. This was used by secret agents to authenticate infiltration missions. Gray spoke as Eleanor's eyes took it all in, her heart torn between the memory of the man she had loved and the truth that was now revealing itself cruelly. "Do you believe he was murdered?" she asked, more as a whisper than a question. "I have no doubt," Archibald replied without blinking, "and I am even more certain that whoever killed him is among us." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, but there was something else in her chest now, something that felt like courage. The following evening at the gala ball, Eleanor descended the stairs with an elegance that morning had failed to erase. She was dressed in a navy blue silk gown with silver trim, her hair tied back with a discreet tiara. Gray, in a black tailcoat, waited at the back of the room with an expression of British restraint. When she approached, he offered her his arm. "If we're going to pretend to be normal, let's do it in style," he said with a half smile. The music began to play, a mournful violin mingling with the rhythm of Viennese waltzes. As they danced, their bodies too close for formality and too far apart for intimacy, they exchanged whispered information. "There's something strange about the Hungarian Count. He exchanges code words with the red-haired waiter at the bar," Archibald murmured. "The Italian painter drew the crest on the bracelet on a napkin yesterday," Eleanor replied. Between dance, steps and veiled glances, the pieces began to move. The ship was sailing across the Atlantic, but the feeling was that something, or someone, had already crossed the boundaries of the game. The morning after the ball, Eleanor woke with a strange sensation, as if the ship had grown heavier, as if something had shifted during the night, not on the deck, but among the masks everyone wore. The letter from Elle, the French bracelet and the furtive glances in the ballroom seemed to be part of a larger picture, and she was beginning to understand that her role was not that of a mere grieving widow. Archibald met her on the observation deck, where few ventured in the biting breeze. "I need to show you something," he said bluntly. He had led her to a restricted area of the hold, where, through an ancient lock and a discreet bribe of a crewman, they had gained access to a forgotten compartment. There, among the boxes of supplies and old diplomatic trunks, they found a leather briefcase, marked with the initials E.W. Edmund Wycliffe. Inside was a black-covered diary, locked with a combination lock. "That shouldn't be here. This hold is for the crew only." Eleanor knelt before the briefcase, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "He knew he would be followed. He hid it here." With Gray's help, they spent hours trying to decipher the combination. Eleanor instinctively typed in their wedding date. The soft click of the mechanism echoed like a whisper from beyond. The diary was written in a mixture of French and ciphers. Each page carried fragments of operations, secret meetings in Prague, encrypted names, and a constant mention of what was called Operation Black Veil. Gray recognized the term immediately. It was an infiltration plan that sought to disrupt Nazi networks on British soil before the war even broke out. Very few people had access to this information. As Eleanor read, her hands trembling over the last few lines of her notes. "If anything happens to me, she needs to know. She deserves to know. But beware of those who feign loyalty. There is more than one traitor." Eleanor closed the diary, her eyes welling up. "He knew he was surrounded, and that I would finish this job for him. That afternoon, one of the passengers, the French writer, approached Eleanor in the reading room. "Forgive me for being so bold, madame, but I believe this bracelet belongs to you." He slid the object across the table, the same artifact bearing the crest of French intelligence. She tried to feign surprise, but her eyes betrayed unease. "Where did you find it?" The man smiled, but there was something in his eyes that chilled her blood. Let's say that certain truths are like ships. They sink if they are too heavy. Before she could react, he stood up and disappeared between the marble columns. Eleanor, distraught, looked for Archibald. The detective, in turn, had new information. He had discovered that the writer had been present in Vienna at the same time, as an operation in which Edmund had participated. A mission that had resulted in 3 deaths and no culprit identified. He is not just a novelist. He is a shadow of the past. That night, Eleanor found another message slipped under her cabin door. This time, the paper was red, the handwriting more aggressive. "He died for love. You will die for curiosity." The words danced before her eyes like a curse. She immediately turned to Archibald, who read the note with pursed lips. "They know we are getting closer. We must act quickly." Gray proposed that for the next few nights they feign estrangement, so as not to draw attention to themselves. If they realize our alliance, they will isolate us. Or worse. Eleanor agreed, though something inside her ached at the thought of having to keep her distance from him just when she yearned for closeness the most. The complicity between them, built on layers of mistrust and truth, already bound them together through more than investigation. There was desire, there was admiration, and now there was danger. The ship was sailing on its course across the ocean, but Eleanor's heart was already sailing through the wreckage of a war that had not yet officially begun. On board, the masks began to slip. A chambermaid had been discovered searching cabins during the night and had mysteriously disappeared the next day. The Hungarian Count, confronted by Gray in a subtle verbal duel, slipped up when he mentioned an operation whose name had never been publicly revealed. The Italian painter revealed herself to be an artist employed by the French Ministry of Culture, but her sketches looked more like maps than landscapes. Eleanor was beginning to move more confidently. With the diary in hand, she and Gray cross-referenced information, piecing together fragments like pieces of a dark puzzle. One night, as they reviewed a coded passage in the wine room, Eleanor stared at him in silence before saying, "Have you ever lost anyone because of a day? Secret?" Gray took his time answering, "Not yet." And then, as if he could no longer resist what was building between them, he kissed her, a restrained, tense kiss, full of everything they could not say out loud. It was a stolen moment from the gathering storm. In the days that followed, Eleanor and Archibald kept up the act of distance, greeting each other politely in public, but avoiding any show of closeness. Behind this farce, however, the investigation was taking shape. During the early hours of the morning, they would meet discreetly in the chart room, a space rarely used by passengers. There, they would pore over the diary's codes, trying to understand exactly what the S-encounter that had been mentioned repeatedly meant. The entries spoke of a clandestine exchange on the high seas, under a neutral flag, involving documents capable of compromising the entire British diplomatic strategy. "My husband was trying to stop it alone," Eleanor whispered, her fingers clutching the diary as if it was still pulsing. Gray watched her in silence, admiring. "He couldn't, but you can." Between the charts and the distant sound of the waves, they became not only partners in investigation, but accomplices in a legacy that Eleanor never expected to inherit. On the morning of the 12th day of the voyage, Eleanor was nearly poisoned. As she drank coffee in the central saloon, she noticed a strange metallic taste at the first sip. Without hesitation, she pushed the cup away and discreetly handed the drink to Gray, who tested it in the dressing room of one of the musicians who was sympathetic to him. The liquid contained traces of digitalis, a slow-acting poison. The news was not reported to the captain, at least not yet, because they knew that there might be some among the crew who were also paying attention. Gray was visibly affected. For the first time since he had boarded the ship, his expression became less calculated. "They tried to silence you. This changes everything." Eleanor, although pale, lifted her chin. "This only confirms that we are close to discovering something real." Later, a new letter was left in Eleanor's cabin, this time handwritten in black ink on scented paper. "If you don't stop, we will repeat Southampton more efficiently." It was a clear threat, using Edmund's death as a warning, or as a confession. That evening, to maintain a semblance of normality, Eleanor accepted an invitation from a group of ladies to a game of cards. Gray, in the next room, pretended to play chess with the Hungarian count, but he used every move to observe the behavior of the other guests. During the game, Eleanor noticed something strange. One of the cards in the deck was marked, a small, barely noticeable dot in the bottom corner. When she disguised herself and observed the rest, she realized that all the cards handed to her had similar markings. It was a code, a form of communication. Someone among them knew she was involved in something bigger. When she discreetly confronted Lady Montrose, one of the hostesses at the table, she received only a dry look and a whisper. "You are playing with fire, my dear. There are things that even the crown cannot control." Eleanor knew in that instant that Bianca Montrose was more than a bored lady looking for a good time, and perhaps it was time to trust her. That same morning, Eleanor and Gray met on the outer deck, where the cold wind was like a razor. He wrapped his overcoat around her, without saying a word, and for long minutes they only listened to the sound of the sea. "You didn't ask how I found out about all this," she said finally, "because you carry in your eyes the weight of someone who has lost, and the stubbornness of someone who still believes." Archibald smiled slightly. "It's a dangerous combination," Eleanor replied with a bitter smile. "It's what remains after mourning, courage or madness. I still don't know which I chose." He pulled her gently, touching her face with an almost painful reverence. "You are stronger than many men I have met in the field, and more cunning than anyone on this ship." The kiss they shared then was more than passion. It was a pact sealed without words, a silent promise that no matter what the cost, they would come out of this storm together. The next day dawned with the announcement that one of the crew had been found unconscious in the boiler room, showing signs of aggression. The captain, visibly concerned, gathered the most influential passengers in a closed session in the conference room. Gray was invited to participate under the pretext of being a security consultant on board. Eleanor, outside, was waiting for news on the lower deck when Lady Montrose appeared, dressed with unusual discretion. "We need to talk, but not here." They took the conversation to the ship's disused sewing room. Bianca took a note sealed with French wax from the bosom of her dress. "Your husband trusted me, and I betrayed him, indirectly. Now I want to help you." Eleanor opened the note with trembling hands. It was in Edmund's handwriting, addressed to B, with a clear warning. "If I fail, trust her. She knows the names." Bianca looked at Eleanor seriously. "The Count is only bait. The real enemy is among those who serve, not those who are served." Eleanor didn't know whether to feel relief or dread, but she knew that they were no longer alone. The masquerade ball was the highlight of the voyage, and for Gray, the perfect opportunity to act. With the complicity of Eleanor and Bianca, he hatched a bold plan. That night, The conspirators would be lured into a performance that would reveal their faces to the world. The main hall was transformed into a theatre of opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast reflections on dresses and capes, while a string quartet filled the air with melancholy waltzes. Eleanor, dressed in black and wearing a lace mask that hid part of her face, moved among the guests like an ethereal figure. Archibald wore an elaborate disguise, a French officer's cloak and a golden mask, a touch of irony considering the content of Edmund's diary. The code for the start of the operation would be a specific piece of the orchestra, Albinoni's Adagio. When the first notes sounded, those involved would act in sync. Eleanor, as she walked among the couples, recognized the Hungarian count handing an envelope to a waiter. The same redhead Gray had already suspected. It was time to tighten the siege. In the improvised dressing room backstage at the ballroom, Gray was studying the nautical chart he had found between the glued pages of the diary. There was a note in red ink marking a point in the middle of the ocean where the ship would stop for technical adjustments. The secret meeting Edmund had mentioned was scheduled for the following morning. They're going to try to exchange it with a smaller vessel, claiming a problem with the ship's hydraulic system. But it's all a facade, Gray explained to Eleanor and Bianca. We have to intercept them first. Eleanor, no longer under any illusions about her husband and unafraid of the truth, suggested using the diary itself as bait. They want that. We'll give it to them, but on our terms. Bianca agreed. If there's ever a time to turn the tables, it's now. Gray, for the first time, let a slight smile show. Very well, ladies. Let's end this dance in style. The orchestra began to play the Adagio. Eleanor moved like a carefully positioned chess piece. As she approached the count, she pretended to stumble and dropped a copy of the diary, just enough for him to see the contents and take the bait. Sure enough, minutes later, he discreetly retreated to the back of the ship. Gray, already positioned among the crew compartments, followed his steps attentively. Eleanor then discreetly handed another fake copy to the red-haired waiter, sealing the plan. What neither of them anticipated was the immediate reaction of a third agent, someone who had hitherto been off the radar, the ship's doctor. He had appeared behind Eleanor with a withering look, muttering, "You dug the wrong grave, Mrs. Wycliffe." Before she could act, Bianca intervened, knocking a glass of wine to the floor to create a distraction. Eleanor seized the moment and escaped, heading to the communications cabin, where Gray was already waiting for her. There, under the dim light of the nautical instruments, they revealed to the captain the evidence they had gathered. The logbook entries, the coded messages, the intercepted copies of the orders exchanged between the spies. The captain, although reluctant, recognized the gravity of the situation. They are using this ship as a platform for an international conspiracy. This will not be ignored. Under discreet orders, access to the main bridge was restricted and surveillance increased. Meanwhile, Gray prepared the final trap, intercepting the boat marked on the map during the supposed technical stop. Eleanor, despite the fatigue and the pressure, remained firm. Edmund died to prevent this. I will live to finish it. Gray placed his hand over hers. And you will live. Together. On the horizon, the stars were the same, but something in the air said that dawn would bring blood. At the appointed time, under the thick fog that covered the sea like a cloak, the launch approached. Small, fast, it flew the flag of a Swedish shipping company. Another facade. Gray, accompanied by two men from the ship's security, and Eleanor, hidden under a navy cloak, waited in silence. When the launch's crew boarded to receive the documents, the trap was closed. Bianca, from high on the deck, signaled the presence of the agents with a mirror. Within seconds, the Hungarian count, the waiter, and the ship's doctor were surrounded. There were screams, a desperate attempt to escape, but the ambush was perfect. In the midst of the chaos, the real diary, which Eleanor had kept hidden the entire time, fell to the deck and opened to the last page. It was a letter from Edmund to her, dated the day before his death, and there, in the silence after the capture, Eleanor read it, her hands trembling but her gaze fixed. "If you are reading this, it is because I trusted the right man to protect you, and the right heart to seek the truth." The first drops of rain began to fall on the deck, timidly at first, but soon intensifying into a storm that seemed to reflect what was yet to come. The night sky was a battlefield of shadows and thunder, and the rough seas made the Celestial Duchess creak like a restless giant. Just when everyone thought the mission was over, a new blow was struck. The body of the communications officer, Lieutenant Howard Reese, was found behind the ventilation towers, his throat slit and his pockets empty. Gray arrived on the scene a few minutes after the discovery and surveyed the scene with icy eyes. Someone is still out there. Someone who knew exactly what the lieutenant discovered. Eleanor, who had been following the investigation with her face wet, not only from the rain, but from the tension, clutched the diary to her chest. He had access to the radio code. He knew we were calling for backup. Gray nodded, his jaw clenched. "He's been silenced. That's a game changer." The captain, pressured by the growing distrust among the passengers, authorized Gray to conduct the investigation independently. The detective assumed unofficial command, establishing watch, shifts among the loyal crew, restricting movement on the upper decks, and requiring all passengers to remain in their quarters at night. Fear spread on board, but also respect. People no longer saw Eleanor as just a widow. There was something in her posture, in her eyes, that conveyed authority and courage. That same night, when she returned to her cabin, she found a red rose on her bed with a single word written on a note: "Curieuse." It was the same handwriting as the previous threat. The gesture, instead of intimidating her, rekindled something in her spirit. The certainty that they were not dealing with simple agents, but with sick minds. By the time she met Archibald in the engine room, he had already come to the conclusion he had been afraid to say. The doctor has escaped. He is the missing link. As lightning lit up the sea, Eleanor and Gray made their way to the infirmary, where everything was upended. Burnt documents in a metal can, tampered medicine bottles, an old photo taped to the inside of the cabinet. In it, Edmund and the ship's doctor, smiling in front of a theatre in Lyon. They knew each other, Eleanor whispered, and he betrayed him. Gray didn't answer. He pulled open a drawer in the desk and found a vial of a dark brown substance labelled in German, Nervenlösung. This was used in interrogations. It makes the victim talk before they pass out. The truth weighed like lead between them. Eleanor sat on the gurney, her shoulders tense, her head down. "I thought I'd cried my eyes out." Gray reached over, touching her fingers. "You don't have to be strong all the time." She looked at him, her eyes moist, and in a burst of despair and hope, she kissed him. It was a kiss filled with silence, but also with purpose. The storm outside made everything more urgent, more alive. Hours later, with the winds calming, Gray gathered the captain and 3 trusted crew members to come up with an emergency plan. The fugitive doctor was still on board, probably hiding among the technical compartments, perhaps even in the supply tanks or refrigeration chambers. A guard dog belonging to one of the officers was released to sniff around. Eleanor, though advised to stay in her cabin, refused. "If anyone needs to face this ghost, it's me." With flashlights in hand and tension cutting through the air like a blade, the search began. The corridors of the hold seemed to breathe on their own, full of shadows and metallic noises. It was Eleanor who found him. First, a figure hunched behind a row of barrels, panting, his eyes dilated. "You've come this far, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice dry. "Edmund would forgive me. You wouldn't." Archibald appeared right behind him, gun drawn. "It's over, Doctor. There are no more veils." But the man smiled. "No, there's still blood." In a sudden gesture, the doctor pulled a blade hidden in the hem of his pants and advanced on Eleanor. Gray reacted with surgical precision. The shot echoed through the hold like a late thunderclap. The body fell at Eleanor's feet, still breathing heavily, her arm scratched by the blade. Gray ran to her, his hand pressing on the slight wound, but his gaze was pure despair. "It's okay, it's okay." She nodded with a shaky smile. "Now, it's over." But they both knew that the deepest wounds do not bleed on the outside. The doctor was the last piece on the board, and with his fall, the net was finally dismantled. When they returned to the surface, the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, tinting the sky orange and violet. The Celestial Duchess continued on its course, but now there was silence. Not the silence of death, but of peace. And there on the damp, salty deck, Eleanor rested her head on Gray's shoulder, and for a few minutes she allowed herself to breathe as if she were alive for the first time. The farewell dinner aboard the Celestial Duchess was scheduled for the last night before arriving at the port of Lisbon. The main hall had been decorated with almost ceremonial delicacy, as if the servants themselves knew that this voyage would leave marks that would never be discussed in public. The candelabras were lit, the champagne was chilled, and the guests, those who knew nothing, toasted the voyage with their stiff smiles. But among those who did know, each gesture carried a second meaning. Eleanor was dressed in white for the first time since Edmund's death, and her serene gaze no longer hid her mourning. Now it was the posture of someone who had overcome grief to face her duty. Archibald Gray, discreet as ever, watched everyone from the side table, his face illuminated by the candles, but his eyes still alert. The final plan would be executed after dessert, a toast in honor of Eleanor's husband, followed by the revelation of the evidence. As the orchestra softened its music and the captain stood to thank everyone for coming, Eleanor was invited to say a few words. She hesitated for a moment, but stood with surprising determination. "When I boarded this ship, I carried with me only pain and doubt. Today, I can say that I carry something more valuable, the truth." There was a brief silence among the guests. She continued, "Sir Edmund Wycliffe, my husband, was not the victim of chance. He was a man of courage, an undercover agent who tried to keep sensitive information from falling into the wrong hands, and he was not alone." At this point, Archibald stood up with a briefcase in his hands. He opened it, carefully, revealing the diary, copies of the codes, the intercepted messages, and the secret recording found during the last inspection of the radio compartment. A voice, Edmund's, echoed through the hall. "If you are listening to this, it is because I have failed. But if Eleanor is there, then there is hope." The hall, filled with amazement, fell into a reverent silence. Several faces turned pale. The Austrian banker, who until then had been seen only as a sponsor of the expedition, tried to stand up, but two security officers, already alerted, stopped him. "I have influential friends," he said, his face tense. "And I have the truth," Archibald replied. Lady Bianca, who until that moment had kept herself among the guests as a simple aristocrat, also stood up, revealing a French resistance insignia beneath her pearl necklace. Those who betray their country must be judged by more than their possessions. It was then that the final confession came from the banker himself, his voice choked with despair. It was by order. We were not the only ones. There were others, other ships. But it no longer mattered. The proof was there. And with the popping of the champagne bottle, the toast was made not to the crossing, but to the memory of those who began it without knowing if they would reach the end. In the captain's cabin, the captured conspirators were kept under guard until they disembarked. The documents gathered by Gray and Eleanor were transmitted by radio to London under secure encryption. The response came a few hours later. Official recognition of the operation, thanks to those involved, and the order that the material be delivered directly to the Portuguese authorities upon arrival at the dock. Gray discreetly declined the offer of an immediate decoration. Leave the applause to the theatres. Here, I prefer silence. Eleanor, in turn, received a letter from the Foreign Office with official condolences and a posthumous recognition of Edmund. But now, with the truth recorded in the archives. As she read the paper in the light from the window, silent tears flowed. He died alone, but he was not forgotten. Gray approached, resting his hand on her shoulder. And you lived long enough to tell your story, and his. Later that night, alone in the cabin, Eleanor opened the diary again. Among the damp-stained pages, she found a sealed envelope hidden in the lining of the cover. Inside was a letter in Edmund's firm handwriting, dated exactly 2 days before his death. My Eleanor, if this diary has reached you, then everything I feared has been confirmed. There may not be time to say goodbye in person, but I want you to know that I loved you beyond the call of duty. I always knew your mind was as sharp as your heart was strong. That it is why I trusted him. Archibald, he would protect you, and maybe, just maybe, he would make you smile again. Eleanor closed the letter with trembling hands, clutching it to her chest. For the first time, she felt free to move forward, not with guilt, but with purpose. The diary, now closed, was no longer a burden. It was a starting point. The Celestial Duchess docked in the port of Lisbon under a clear sky and a shy sun that gilded the waters as if trying to erase the memory of the storm. On board, Portuguese soldiers and representatives of the British Embassy waited with serious faces and briefcases in hand. The passengers disembarked slowly, many still unaware of what had really happened during the crossing. For Eleanor, the moment had the weight of a new birth. She was dressed simply, without adornments, but there was an unprecedented resolve in her face. No longer the woman who had embarked under the weight of mourning, but someone who had discovered within herself a strength she had previously thought did not exist. Gray followed her closely, discreetly, with a watchful eye, not only for any threats that might arise, but for that moment that marked the end of something profound. Lisbon, she murmured, feeling the warm air of the city. We arrived alive and changed, he replied. The officers led the prisoners away discreetly, avoiding fanfare. Documents and recordings were handed over to British security agents, while the Portuguese embassy provided temporary accommodation for those involved in the investigation. Bianca Montrose, now undisguised, was invited to give evidence alongside Eleanor. I'm not one for deep roots, she had said as she embraced Eleanor before leaving. But in you, I found something like faith. Eleanor simply smiled, holding her hand firmly. As the crowds on the platform dissipated, Gray and Eleanor walked to the end of the pier, where they could see the ship in the distance, a monument to all they had left behind. The wind carried with it the smell of salt and change. Gray took a small manila envelope from his pocket. From MI6. They want to know if I'm ready for another case. Eleanor raised her eyebrows. half surprised and half curious. "Arthur, you?" He hesitated, then looked at her. "That depends. Will you be my assistant?" Eleanor laughed for the first time in a long time. Not a forced or convenient laugh, but a light sound that broke through the last layers of pain. "Assistant is a modest word for what I became aboard that ship." Gray smiled, extending his arm, which she took without ceremony. They walked side by side along the cobblestones of the dock, unhurried. There were no more pressing questions, no shadows following them, only the sound of the waves lapping against the docks and the murmur of the city looming ahead like a promise. Eleanor knew there were no guarantees, that the world was still on the brink of a war that many pretended not to see. But she also knew that within her there was now a new compass, and that with Gray by her side, she might find not only justice, but also a rare kind of love that is born not of wonder, but of trust. Before heading to the Embassy Hotel, Eleanor glanced one last time at the Celestial Duchess. For a moment, she saw herself on the deck, in her hat and gloves before it all began, still unaware that the ship that was supposed to take her to oblivion would, in fact, take her back to her true self, to the truth, to the past, to herself. She touched the silver locket she wore around her neck, the only object of Edmund's that she had decided to keep. "Farewell, my love," she whispered to the sea. But this time there was no pain in her voice. There was gratitude. Gratitude for the memory, for the sacrifice, and for having prepared her without knowing it for something greater. With Gray by her side, she left the port with firm steps. The world was too big to live on ghosts, and the next chapters she would write with her own hands. And so the Celestial Duchess was left behind, amidst the masts, the whispers, and the glitter of the past. The city opened like a new book, and the blank page that Eleanor carried in her chest was now a promise of action, of justice, of love. And that, even after mourning, betrayal, and pain, the human heart can still begin again. For it was not the end, it was the port of a new life. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel, leave a like and activate notifications so you don't miss future content. See you later.